Good morning. It's time for the Mike Hewitt Show, brought to you by Renegade River in Spring Lake. And here's your host, Mike Hewitt. Good morning, Mike.
Hey, good morning, Brian. Good morning, Jim Riley. Good morning, folks. Listen, I want us to do a little exercise this morning. I'm going to start, if I might, by taking us back to the year 1962, just for fun. In 1962, The Courtship of Eddie's Father was a movie. Later, it became a series.
Very popular TV show for the whole family.
It was, and I got to tell you, what else happened that year was a Beverly Hillbillies episode. Happened to be one of my favorite shows when I was a kid.
What a great show!
It really was.
What a great show!
And well, listen, it's kind of a funny thing because now that I'm 54, and so once in a while when you find yourself watching an old sitcom, it's like memory lane, and it's a feel-good thing. You think, it's Beverly Hillbillies. I love that show. I sit back and watch it. And I did recently. And I saw things that I didn't see when I was 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old.
Okay, you have the memories, as do I, of the old shows that you watched when you were of a certain age. Sometimes you were even an adult, but as a child or a young adult or what have you. Then you look at it today. You've got a few years under your grizzled belt, and you're seeing a different kind of show.
It's an amazing thing.
Wow.
It really is. Beverly Hillbillies episode 1962 is about wealth distribution. and it's also attack on quoratism and anything that resembles success in America. That's the message that's built in it. It includes quite an exchange between Jane Hathaway, the banker, the evil banker Drysdale, and of course Jed, who's the old wise guy, wise person, wise man, if you will. But they're bantering back and forth because Drysdale's trying to talk him into an incorporate to not. And they go through the old adage about how it's illegal to evade, it's okay to avoid taxation. And the irony to it is that, of course, I'm a policy wonk, so I start looking at it, and we forget that the tax rates were in the 70+% at the time, and so loopholes were a major thing. And was it Republican and Democrat? You betcha. The Democrats wanted outrageous tax, and as a result, the Republicans were constantly looking for ways to make that more palatable so successful people can keep. At any rate, the whole movie is wrapped, the whole sitcom episode is wrapped around the concept of Jed sharing his wealth, which was going to stimulate the economy and all kinds of things. And watching it now with my policy wonk hat on, I'm aghast. And it helps explain to me how we got from being a successful America to where almost half of us are dependent on the federal government.
Well, I do think it's interesting that the best time to change a human being's political outlook, change how they view the world, is not when they're in college or not when they're in high school, but when they are very, very young. And I think that you bring up, to me, one of the examples that anybody can agree on, and that is the way that the banker has, for so many decades, perhaps even centuries, been portrayed as the evil bad guy.
Unless you need money.
Well, not only that, it's unless you need money or unless your employer needs some money to start up. But the banker, as the meanie, because he asks you to fulfill your half of the bargain, which was they'll loan you money and you promise to pay back on a particular, very specifically agreed upon schedule. That's a great point because when I think back, bankers, well, even to this day, are still demonized in almost any kind of television show. And of course, one of the biggest ones, the bankers or the financial business, was the movie Wall Street. And of course, remember, the greed is good, which frankly, Ayn Rand would agree with that. And there's certainly an argument to the fact that certainly self-interest is good. But the demonization of certain industries, which is kind of interesting given how close President Obama is to the Goldman Sachs executives and others within that world. But anyway,
That part's all hypocrisy.
Well, there
for
we
instance,
go.
For instance, Hillary is now really playing to the hard uber left. And the irony to that is that she's probably one of the greatest corporate animals that we've seen in D.C. in a very long time. So, and of course, the uber left closes their eyes and forgets that part because they like the messaging she's talking about.
Now they do, yeah. Well, as a matter of fact, you would see that when and certainly Republicans have been close to evil bankers and evil Wall Streeters, the people who were on the other side of the political aisle would be the first to bring that up.
The three great fears of my lifetime have been, first, the world is overpopulated and people are going to starve to death. Do you remember that? That was right before the coming ice age.
Oh, sure. Who was the author of that? He's still around, by the way. The person. Well, of course, it goes back way back.
Oh, yeah.
I wish I had my memory was working on that, but the person who's made a career of predictions, who wrote the book, which was very popular, I believe, in the late '60s or early '70s, is still alive and is still a very powerful voice. And actually, interestingly, he has moved on as a very vocal supporter of the global warming.
No kidding.
Yeah,
there's a shock.
There's a shock.
Well, it's all about moving voter block. It's got nothing to do with anything else. Do you remember the courtship of Eddie's father? I talked about it real brief earlier.
Sure.
At the beginning of the series that ran from 69 to 72, and I never knew this, by the way. I was, I'm 54. You can do the math of where I was at in 69. So as a little child, and 9, 10, 11 years old, watching the courtship of Eddie's father, I wasn't thinking political. But the beginning of it starts out, I remember him dancing across a beach. But when you can see this on YouTube, by the way, folks, if you just type in there the courtship of Eddie's father theme, you'll see the opening. And I'm expecting to see the old song. And what I see is father, son. Dad says, Dad, why do we have rules? Father, so people can live together in peace and harmony.
Well, now that seems pretty reasonable.
It does reason. I'm with him on it. And the child says, I don't know if we have too many rules or not enough. And Dad says, maybe we have too many people. Child says, well, then maybe then we need more rules. And the adult wisely says, well, then we have less freedom. Child says, what do we do about this? And the father says, now you put your little thumb right on the exact problem. I'm telling you this, folks, because it's getting us used to uber regulation and restriction. And so you've heard me say on this show before that the America I grew up in had a lot more liberty and freedom than it does now, and I fear for my grandchildren's future. It goes to these little platitudes of getting people used to the idea that we need to crank it down tight. And I pause and I think, well, where do they get these concepts from? Because that surely isn't how it's necessary to live in Muskegon or Ottawa County. And then I remember most of these people are 5,000 people deep living on a postage-sized piece of lot in either New York or L.A., but they think the whole world is like that. And so they legislate, they regulate, and they campaign for that kind of politics. Am I wrong?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, obviously, the folks who put together television shows, people who write books, put together radio shows, and other means of mass communication all have particular views. Now, whether they are focused on politics or not certainly may be debated, but there's little question, certainly today, but as I think that what's nice about this particular episode of your show is that we're talking about years and years ago. In other words, the indoctrination that young people are being put under, being exposed to through their entire lives, which we do know. I mean, the television media, certainly the sitcoms and the rest of them, have a very strong political bent. And by the way, the Thomas Malthus is the 19th, 18th, and 19th century great thinker who promulgated the concept that human beings would quite shortly run out of food as the population of the earth grew. And, of course, in his theory, the production of food remained the same. Of course, we know that the population of the earth has gotten significantly higher, but not nearly as high as man's ingenuity, man's ability to increase food production and the quality of the food for folks. So
making creating or growing far more food on far less land.
On far less land. And the point being, of course, is that if in fact government and the Nazis under Adolf Hitler had this view, if in fact you want to control the amount of population, the Chinese communists, of course, are in the process of have been doing this for many, many decades. That gives enormous amounts of power to those who are in power, and one of the perhaps unintended consequences, even in China today, communist dictatorship today, is that young men must get the okay of government in order to marry, because there are so few girls and young women because of the Chinese culture, which, number one, the law requires the abortion of any child, I believe, in a family over two, numbering more than two. And if you are going to abort a child, or, as is quite often the case in China, murder a young child immediately after birth, you're going to murder, according to their culture, a girl. So now you have this tremendous shortage of young women, and in order to get married, you have to go to the government in order to get the okay. That's the transfer of power.
By the way, since you segued us in a slight different direction for a minute, let me make a point, and then we'll go back to TV. But there's no time in history where that type of culture didn't inevitably have to go to war against its neighbors to cause its own culture to keep going, because there is a shortage of females, and that's been the case through a number of historical cultures, and every single one of them, to save themselves, had to take on neighboring countries so that they could continue on.
Well, if you buy into your concept here, which is in fact that there is politics going on in our everyday life, you can see that people will be willing to accept the wild situations like a shortage of young women in order to save the earth. If the population is the issue and you give the power to government, people will be accepting the tremendous disruption and the murder, obviously, of young babies in order to save the earth.
Listen, I'm not saying there's a little bit of politics in TV media. I'm saying there's a total absence of conservative ideology in sitcoms, and that it's just not our little window of reference. I heard you do a promo for the show, and you talked about the Twilight Zone. It goes back to at least the Twilight Zone. It was in the Twilight Zone. It was a part of it. It was part of My Favorite Martian. It was part of Star Trek. It was part of all of them are advocating a very different form of government and form of economy than America was built strong by. And so I sit back and I'm looking at our culture now. I'm saying, how in the heck? Let me give you a funny short example. I'm at a party store, gas station party store, convenience store nowadays, and I'm waiting in line. And I gotta tell you, I had to bust out laughing. I was a little bit embarrassed at myself for not being able to control my laugh. I heard you folks this morning talk about Mad Max.
Sure.
I felt like I was in a Mad Max episode, and I know I'm older, and so everyone's going to say, "Oh, Mikey, you're being judgmental." Everyone there, they had earrings, not eyelet earrings over their lips, their eyebrows, and they had tattoos from their chins to their knuckles. And I'm looking around going, "This looks like a Mad Max episode," and I can't help but, in fact, that's kind of what got me on this path today. I'm thinking, how in the heck did we get from a culture that put your hat on before you went outside to people looking like they're dressed like Morticia made their clothing? And
of course, you know that my parents' generation would have said that about all the long hairs in the mid-'60s.
But you can cut your hair off when you get your brain back. You can't undo all the holes in your face.
Well, there is that. Or those... Well, you know, I've always wondered, because one of the things that guarantees you unemployment and extensions of unemployment and various other benefits for those who are unable to find work is that if you pierce yourself into a position where no employer would hire you,
especially since you can hardly speak English and you can't write at all.
Well, there is that. But let's go back. You know, again, I know we got a break coming up, but one of the things that's gotten me is the disconnect that Americans seem to have when we see these young people, these young men, and in some cases young women, who will put on a suicide vest and go out and murder folks who they generally know to be innocent civilians. And you wonder, how can that happen? Well, it happens because these poor youngsters were brainwashed in madrasas into believing things that we all know to be morally wrong and obviously foolish.
So the difference, though, let me just stop you.
Sure.
The difference, though, is that in those circumstances, we're talking about some really deep, hard, very impacting brainwashing. But in our culture, it's a generational slow drip, but it's just as effective.
If it's nonstop, you bet.
It's just, well, you can't, I've got, on my personal page, between the personal page on Facebook and the show's page, and by the way, folks, if you're listening, find us on Facebook at The Mike Hewitt Show. There's a lot of people on those two pages, and I'm asking them, give me an example of a conservative sitcom. And out of well over 5,000 people, I got one example. And you go, that's kind of amazing.
Well, and sitcoms are one, but take a look at the hospital shows. Take a look at the police shows. Take a look at virtually every drama. My gosh, one of the most popular television shows in history was The West Wing.
Was The West Wing, but listen, we've got to go to a break. But when we come back, we're going to talk about probably the most popular show, at least in my lifetime, the Archie Bunker Show. All in the Family. Folks, we'll be right back.
Renegade River in Spring Lake wants to buy your used handguns and hunting guns. Renegade River, your hunting, camping, and survival store. Stop in and check out their new and used firearms, sporting goods, Army and Navy supplies, and survival gear. Downtown Spring Lake, next to the police station.
Welcome back to the Mike Hewitt Show. Jim Riley, I got to tell you, when All in the Family came out, I thought that was absolutely the funniest, best show there was.
Yep, and it was I think at the time it was the most popular TV show around.
It was humor. It really was. It was funny humor. Now when I look back, and I've got my political hat on, I see what they've done, because I think to myself, how come it is that culture in general in America has decided, we've made some collective decision, that if you're conservative, you're an ignorant racist? And
well, we've had decades and decades of TV shows like like All in the Family to push that concept into your brains very subtly.
But I sit, and let me put my political party hat on for a minute, and everyone's heard this. And when I look at the history of the Republican Party and racism, in terms of Abe Lincoln with the Civil War to end slavery, the civil rights which was a Republican action. And everything in between, voting rights, the whole list of the gauntlet of things that the Republican Party did in the name of liberty for all, versus the Democratic Party, which did do the slavery, which did fight to maintain. And I'm thinking, how did we get from the reality of what actually has taken place
in our history?
We got from what you can write down on paper. These things happened. Martin Luther King was a Republican. How did we get from that to the assumption that all conservatives and Republicans are ignorant, poorly educated racists? And it comes from sitcoms like Archie Bunker.
I think you're right. And an endless list of, again, I'll say not just sitcoms, drama shows too. But it's gone on. And when was All in the Family popular? It was in the early 70s. I'm not sure. Did it even go back to the 60s? But
I don't think so.
It's been in our culture for decades and decades and decades. They still use Archie Bunker. Actually, culture in general, not them. Culture in general, what an Archie Bunker he was. I mean, it's turned into like a tagline to make a statement about somebody.
Isn't it kind of human nature to, when you don't agree with something or don't totally understand,
to demonize it?
Is to, or just stereotype, to generalize.
You bet.
When you're not a part of that, just like when you don't like a certain type of music.
Brian, you're absolutely right.
You generalize. It all sounds the same. But
the people who would listen to that music are a bunch of country bumpkin bozos.
So, but then when you get into that type of music, you realize there is differences, and you appreciate things more once you accept it, or at least open your mind to it. So maybe that's.
But you're not seeing that alternative on shows like All in the Family. And I would just suggest one thing that propagandists know. Apparently, no one in the Republican Party has read anything about this. But Adolf Hitler's minister of propaganda, Goebbels, made a phrase that was, to me, stunning, that it seems Republicans aren't familiar with it. A lie repeated often enough becomes a truth. And therein lies the success of our major media in taking over, because they tended to be left-wing folks. I mean, openly, you can look at all of the political contributions of the Hollywood left going back decades and decades and decades. They're proudly liberal, and they have succeeded not by being clever, like Archie Bunker and all, but by consistently and endlessly and relentlessly clever. And what's the best way in American culture today to totally humiliate someone? Not to say that you're a racist or say that you're a bad person, but to make fun of them. You're a fool.
Sure. It's bullying is really what it is.
Well, it's clever, and actually it's a sort of accepted form of bullying. You bet it is.
But now we hear periodically, we'll go through this little political thing. They'll talk about the fairness doctrine in radio, and
can you explain the fairness doctrine so people understand?
There was a law in the books once upon a time that said if there's a conservative, there must be a liberal,
or vice versa. But of course,
it had to be equal.
You had to equal radio stations and television stations. If they had a political point of view TV show, they had to offset that with someone of the opposite political point of view.
The problem with that is that that's not necessarily what people at large want to hear, and the result of that was the ratings were horrific.
And you didn't have those shows on TV or radio, again, because people weren't interested in hearing the other side.
So the uber left has taken that and said, listen, we can do the same thing. We can. In fact, one of the points we made off the air before the show started was there used to be in most towns, most communities had competing papers, larger communities.
Sure.
So
at least two.
New York still has the Post and they have the Times. I believe that they're both uber left.
Well, they have the Daily News.
Okay, there you go. But in America in general, you no longer have that kind of choice. But back then when that was the case, then the newscaster didn't try to fool you into thinking that he or she was reporting the news. They let you know this is a conservative paper or this is a liberal paper and this is our viewpoint and this is the news from our angle. But people knew what they were reading and they made a choice. Now what they've done, since we can debate it, but from the late 50s forward, in my view, they've taken that and they've figured out how to include it in all of these sitcoms and all of the newses. They've just dominated mass media.
Well, think about this. The presidential election is coming up soon, and before the presidential election is a series of presidential debates. We have seen some serious abuse in the last run with folks like CNN's Candy Crowley, throwing out gotcha questions in the debates. Her political persuasion pretty clear. You would have figured the Republicans would have learned a little bit about that and said, look, we're going to have a debate, but we're not going to have a flagrantly, ignorantly biased person who's going to be throwing the questions at us. The Republicans agreed to have George Stephanopoulos, now who was one of the supreme insiders in the Clinton campaign.
Pretty unbiased guy, don't you know?
Who has had a history, even though he's not a journalist, he's been on television for many, many years.
He's reinvented himself as a journalist.
Well, and he's certainly not a journalist in a classic sense, but the facts are that his political persuasion is clear, and now we find out that he is paid. He sort of conveniently forgot that he gave $75,000 to Hillary Clinton's personal slush fund.
You know the fun part about that, the side note fun?
And he wants to be viewed as an unbiased arbiter.
He's unbiased, but the entire ideology of the left is based on classism. So we're going to hate the one percenters, these successful people.
Oh, yes.
Well, what kind of man, what kind of person can give $75,000 away?
Well, and forget about it, not realize that he did. It's his excuse. He said, oh, geez, I didn't even know I did that.
I don't know how. And I'm trying to put my head around the grassroots thought process on the left. I really am genuinely. I'm not trying to mock or be funny. I don't understand how the average person that considers themselves a leftist can embrace what to me is striking hypocrisy. And I mean that sincerely. I'm not trying to be anything but...
I think it says a lot about the kind of voter. I do think, and we know this, that if a Republican is diddling a young, unpaid worker If a Republican is to set up a scam charity fund, not only will the media jump all over him, as well they should, Republican voters and the Republican Party will push them out.
Well,
if it's a Democrat, it doesn't seem that the voters, that doesn't seem to bother those who are consistent, solid Democrat voters.
So if you got a guy in his restroom, public restroom, and he's tapping his feet on the floor, they're going to run him out of office and throw him in the dust heap of history. But if the guy is actually breaking his vows and everything else in the Oval Office, we're going to pay him millions of dollars a year after he's out of office to hear him speak.
It says something about the kind of people who will vote for that person. There are always going to be bad, dishonest, and immoral people. But there is a political party that generally says if you are one of those, we're going to hound you out of the party. There is another political party that says, look, if you're that way, as long as you give us the votes, it's okay. What is the party of Al Sharpton? What is the party of Bill Clinton? What is the party of so many? Matter of fact, Hillary Clinton's daughter is married to a man whose father was forced out as a United States congressman and sent to prison. Well, and his wife was immediately reelected to the seat.
Did Bill and Hillary say, I'll meet you there? Or?
Apparently not.
Listen, for a lot of these folks, let's dial up to cable news for just a moment. If you look at the major cable news companies, CNB, was it? How do you say? I always say PMSNBC. I've got to caution myself.
Well, there's MSNBC, and then but cable news is CNBC.
So I was
and
wrong.
Fox News,
Fox
CNBC.
News. If you look at the top 5 of them, because that's the list I was looking at, Fox News, it's over. It equals more than the next 4 combined. And so I paused and I said, they've been doing this for a long time, pushing hard left like NBC. Not just leftism, hard leftism. And
who has been pushing left?
Cable NBC.
Okay, CNBC. Well, okay, hold on. CNBC is the business end. They're not very political. You're thinking about MSNBC.
MSNBC.
That's the one that's beyond.
I told you I was always confused. I kept calling it something totally different, folks. I'm telling you, when you look at the cable, in fact, if you're looking up, I don't know if you are or not, but the top 5, Fox's is greater ratings than the next 4 down combined. Now, these guys are not stupid people at these other cable news networks, and this has been going on for a decade. So you'd think at some of their board meetings, they'd sit down and say, listen, we need to change our format. Let's give Fox a run for their money. And the fact that they are not changing their format tells you this isn't about ratings. I've heard in the past, in fact, it's been said on this show before by guests, this is all about ratings. It's all about commercial sales and all of that. On the surface, I'd go, yeah, I get it. I understand. But the reality of it is that if that were the case, they would change their format because it's not working. And since they're not changing their format, I'm left to believe that it's a campaign and nothing more.
Well, let me explain to you very simply the answer. None of these companies are standalone, okay? Fox needs to make a profit, but MSNBC and NBC, up until recently, were owned by General Electric. Where does the vast majority of the profits come from General Electric? Government contracts. And so if you are a multi-billion-dollar corporation and you've got 2 relatively small divisions, NBC TV and MSNBC TV, if they are losing money, that's okay as long as their political decisions and how they report the news puts you in favor with the current administration. So I'm not exactly sure who owns the CNN. It is no longer a standalone. I know Comcast is jumped in there and has bought a lot of these. But what's happened in the old days, you had to have a product that people would buy. Today, you do not. If you're a newspaper, if you're a radio show, if you are a television system, you don't need that. If you're part of a much, much larger corporation, they can actually use you as their advertising and their. Think about this. Let's say someone found out, and we did find this out. NBC found out about the Bill Clinton, to me, the totally embarrassing situation, abusing an unpaid aide in Monica Lewinsky. They sat on it. Now, why would they sit on it? It was only until the Drudge Report came out and brought that information out. So you can be sure that if they had that information,
it may drudge.
It may drudge.
And listen, right now in Washington, D.C., there are people there, elected officials, looking at ways to regulate and get to the point where drudge is gone.
You betcha.
They want to kill that organization.
Well, and think about this, though. If NBC has got the goods on the Clintons, for instance.
I bet you they do right now,
well,
with all of the email gate, etc.
Well, you can be sure that there's information that the media knows and is not bringing public. What happens to all of these executives?
You make it sound like it's not news.
When they leave their companies, they go into government.
They get a job.
And they go back and forth, you bet.
No question about it. The question that I have, though, when you get all said and done with it, when we as a society sit back and look at 50 years of absolute over-the-top, uber-left marketing, buried in not even hardly buried into all of our sitcoms, all of our media, the mass communications from every angle includes nothing but uber-left marketing. And it's a big, gigantic political campaign for a single party. The compliment that I get to include, though, is that when you look at 50 years of that, and we can document that it existed for those that don't agree, when you get to that point and you look around America now, you think, wow, there's still conservatives. The Republican Party still holds dominance on state governments
how could that happen with all
across
of
the
this?
United States. You go, that tells you really exactly how wonderful of a country our founders set up and how our conservative values are not quite as squishy as the left wishes, to have invested 50 years in this nonsense, and they're still having to fight the fight.
Well, and we know that the left wants to bring in the fairness doctrine, which we know would kill certainly radio shows like Rush Limbaugh and the Hannity and the rest of them. What we're seeing is if you cannot beat someone on the issues, the single best way
silence them
is to shout them down,
yeah,
make sure that people cannot hear what they're saying.
We used to call that fascism.
Well,
now we call it the fairness doctrine.
And again, make no mistake, folks, people are out there today, elected Democrats, 100% of these people pushing it are from the left, trying to codify the fairness doctrine and bring it back.
And listen, I'm the other way on some of these things. For these talk shows that are left wing, I'm okay with them being on the air. First off, I fight for their right to be there.
Absolutely.
That's what the First Amendment is. And the other thing is that some of their ideas are pretty doggone goofy, and so let the people hear them.
That's my view, too. When you hear what they have to say. Matter of fact, if you listen to right-wing hate radio, talk radio, you will find that much of the conversation is verbatim repetition of what's going on in the left media. The right-wing media wants people to hear what those on the left are putting together and what the future holds.
Listen, I would rather that than to have them stick their messaging aimed at my 3, 4, and 5-year-old grandchildren.
Well, that's happening.
We'll probably touch on that. Folks, we've got to go to a break, but we'll be right back.
Be a survivor, not a statistic. Renegade River in Spring Lake has new and used handguns, hunting guns, sporting goods, and survival gear. Protect your rights and your freedom. Ask about their CPL classes. Renegade River, next to the police station in downtown Spring Lake.
Welcome back to the Mike Hewitt Show, in with Jim Riley. Listen, Jim, I was sitting back a while back with 2 of my grandchildren, and we're watching a cartoon, and the cartoon is geared for probably 3 to 5-year-olds.
So it was perfect for your particular age group, too.
Yes, I was dialed right in.
There we go.
Listen, I was genuinely insulted, and I'm not one of those, easily offended Americans, but I'm watching this with my very young grandchildren. And it's a bunch of cars going around a big track, and the cars talk, and the bumpers are smiles, and the headlights are eyes, and the bumpers can smile, and they're talking, and they're racing. And all of a sudden, in the middle of that, out of nowhere, races up a police car. And the police car is screaming at the rest of the cars, over the top zealot police car. And it's clearly a shot at police officers in general.
So the police car was kind of the bad guy
The police
in this
officer
cartoon.
the police officer was as mean, evil, nasty. And I'm thinking, do we truly want to teach this to
That's what the little kids are getting
That's
today.
what they're, and listen, I'm watching this,
Wow.
and my mouth flopped open. I told my grandkids, we're done, we're going to go out now, because we're not watching that trash. And I'm of course, I'm old now. I get to look back and I'm talking about grandkids and not my own kids. And I think it's becoming more and more difficult as a parent to try to filter out all of these over-the-top messages. And I'm wondering how many parents realize that and maybe don't pause and say, this is having an effect on my child's outlook of the culture we live in.
How many parents even bother to sit and watch with their children or watching on television? If the kids are happy, why should the parents be involved? It wasn't that long ago. This is back in the early 90s. Do you remember the movie or the TV show, The New Adventures of Captain Planet and the Planeteers? This was a cartoon show put together by Ted Turner that was pure environmentalism. Now, this show ended in 1996, but guess what? It is still in syndication. So, yes, the left has figured out you can send a message to young folks, and it will be listened to, because I would suspect that a lot of today's crazy, over-the-top environmentalism, and now we're seeing the anti-police and others, were all little seeds, little acorns in children's heads early on that the parents didn't even know were happening.
Yeah, Matt on Facebook writes, soon your children will be expected to tell officials when you oppose the government.
Yeah, good one, Matt.
Listen, on the line with us today is Mark Lynn of the Muskegon Pistol Club. Mark, welcome back to the Mike Hewitt Show.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Thanks for having us.
Lee, I'm excited to have you about what you folks are doing, especially the training part. I think, in fact, Jim Riley did a little promo for you on the show before this to announce that you were going to be on and so forth.
Okay, good.
With Renegade River as a gun shop, obviously I've got
You have an agenda.
I have an agenda, but I'm not going to cleverly stick it in with marshmallows and chocolate and try to fool people. I'm teasing a little bit. Listen, I'm a big advocate of the Second Amendment and firearms as a sport, firearms as a defense, in all of the ways that word is meant. Having said that, I'm also a safety nut, and when I'm being safe with firearms, they go hand in hand. You can't just go, oh, jeepers, I'll be careful. You have to actually be trained and know what you're doing, and I passionately believe that. And so, Mark Lynn, that's where you come in. You do a little bit of training, don't you?
Yeah, I do quite a bit of training, Mike. I actually just got done with a great group of guys and gals last Wednesday, Thursday. And actually, yeah, part of that, the NRA has us cover a large section when we teach the personal protection in the home, which is what is required in the state of Michigan to, obtain your CPL. And yeah, gun safety around kids, gun safety in the home in general. So by and large, a lot of, gun safe handling, safe storage. I don't know how it goes.
Do you do? Did you have on that list that you do early or amateur? What would be the right word? Novice training, basic training.
Yeah, we do personal one-on-one training, which I've done.
Okay, so if I'm new to firearms, and I'm thinking about maybe going to CPL class to carry, would you advise to have a novice or a beginner's class?
Yes. Not only would I advise it, the NRA requires it.
Okay. So
you have to be proficient and safe in the handling of a firearm. That's a prerequisite to the class.
Okay. Well, so I come to your class. I'm new to firearms. Do I bring a gun? Do I use yours? What do we do that day? How does it work?
I have a couple different options. I really prefer to have somebody bring a firearm that they already have.
Okay.
Now, if somebody doesn't have a firearm, I have a firearm or a few firearms that I can, that folks can use. I have a revolver and I've got, semi-automatics and that kind of thing. Last thing I want somebody to do, Mike, is come see you prior to knowing what they need. Does that make sense?
I do.
Okay. Obviously, fit, caliber, what's comfortable. If somebody's comfortable shooting a 45 ACP, that's great. But just because you have a 45 ACP doesn't mean you're going to be comfortable or safe with it.
Wow. Okay. So do you have some recommendations on what kind of firearms a beginner should be looking at?
Yes. Try as many as possible.
Okay.
Prior. Obviously, as you know, selling firearms, Mike, the revolver is probably the most simple firearm to start on. If somebody has no or very little experience,
Right.
There's not the complexity of a magazine, slides, just general issues that can happen with a semi-automatic firearm. You don't have the failure to fires. You don't have the failure to feeds. There's no such thing as a stovepipe in a revolver. I mean, it's just a little more of it's a lot more simple platform.
Listen, there's a couple different things I've noticed, and part of it goes to when you were kind of teasing to say, try them all or something like that, or a lot of them. What will happen is when someone that's new to firearms comes to Renegade River, we'll literally, because I often joke, they'll say, well, what do you recommend? And I say, it's like picking out somebody else's underwear.
Yeah,
let me first off, when I pull a firearm out of a display case, even if I just put it there, I go through a process of making sure it's unloaded. I have the customer hold it, make sure the customer's, and usually a person will have an idea right away. This fits my hand, it doesn't, it's comfortable or it's not. To your point about the difference between a wheel gun, a revolver, and a semi-automatic, some folks don't have the finger or hand strength to pull back to pull the slide back on a semi-automatic to get it loaded and to pull up a shell out of the magazine.
Yep.
And so you got a chamber around. So I'll have some older folks come in and who have maybe been carrying a semi-automatic all of their life, so they're very experienced, but they're going to go back to revolver because of that. And then on the other hand, to your point, if you're not really proficient with a firearm, the wheel gun, the revolver, is a lot more of a simple operation. I often joke and call it the original point and click technology.
That's correct.
If you pull the trigger and it doesn't go bang, pull it again, it's probably going to go bang. And most modern firearms are pretty doggone dependable in that regard. Now, I've had people angry with me before on that note. They'll say, "Where's the safety on this?" And I do the safety on. That's where my finger is way away from the trigger. Safety off. That's where my finger is on the trigger. Safety on, safety off.
The biggest safety, Mike, is really between your ears.
Yep. Absolutely.
And every mechanical safety can and will fail at some point. So you have to use common sense. You have to be very, very safe and handle a firearm accordingly.
Yeah, I'm not sure the numbers in Muskegon County. You may know, but I know in Ottawa they tell me that there's approximately 12,000 CPL holders, or people that have been authorized to carry a concealed weapon. And I don't know if it was you or someone that told me that on a statewide basis, Michigan sits at a little over 500,000 CPL holders.
Yeah,
that was
that last time.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Those are big numbers. I think that surprises a lot of people. And it scares the very left, and of course people like me, I applaud it. What do you think?
It's kind of a double-edged sword. I'm a strong believer in a Second Amendment. I'm a strong believer in folks owning and operating firearms.
Right.
But it's like anything else. Do you go from 14 years old to driving an automobile down 75 miles an hour on a highway without training? This
all goes to training. There's a picture that hangs on the safe at Renegade River, and in fact, it's been on the Facebook page for this show, and it shows 3 children that I'm going to guess they're 9 or 10 years old, and they're in a public school classroom, and they're having rifle safety class. And so the one young man is holding a rifle, and the other 2 are watching very, very closely. I say that story because, listen, we're not the mistake that the folks that are anti-gun make is to assume that they're going to someday get rid of firearms. You can't. The technology is 1,200 years old. I mean, I could go home and in a couple hours I could rig up a pseudo firearm that would fire. So just to pass a law and say, okay, there's no more firearms is not possible. Russia's tried it. Russia's got a 5 times higher murder rate than the United States, and yet they've got.
Let me bring this back down to another point, Mike.
Okay, sure. Yep.
If you look in Europe, look what happens. Look at the ramifications for a drunk driving. Okay, I'll bring this back to drinking and driving, or whatever you want to call it.
Sure.
Folks in Europe, and I don't know, I shouldn't say, maybe make this analogy here, but okay, in Europe, there really is no drinking age. So a child can sit at the dinner table and have a glass of wine with their parents.
With their parents, right?
Yes. Okay. What my point is here is to say that anything that's taboo generates more curiosity.
Right.
So if your child doesn't know or is not acquainted with a firearm in your own home, and you think you're going to protect that child for 18, 19 years,
right,
that they're never going to see a firearm.
We have more accidental shootings now, percentage-wise, than we did when there were less firearms being owned, but more training. Training is just absolutely fundamental. And now, listen, we've only got a couple minutes left, and one of the things I want to make sure is that people know how to find you. So tell people how to get a hold of you, where you're located, those kind of things, Mark.
We are located just east of the Lakes Mall here in Muskegon. We are on North Quarterline Road. So if you know where My Auto Import Center is, the next road past that is Quarterline. You would take a left, and we are the inside gun range on Quarterline.
Okay. Is there a website, Mark?
Yep. You can go to MuskegonPRC.com and check us out there.
Okay. Email address?
And, no, not right now.
Okay. How about a phone number?
They can use mine, which is 231-578-8883.
Very, very nice. Mark, thanks for being on the show again. I look forward to seeing you again. Jim Riley, I'm going to be in here with you on Friday morning. Is that right?
You betcha. We got 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock, the Talk of Muskegon, with it's the Jim and Mike show as opposed to the Mike and Jim show.
That ain't bad.
Holy macaroni.
You got to bring donuts. I brought donuts when it was my show.
I will bring the donuts.
Folks, thank you very much. We will see you on Friday.
Renegade River in Spring Lake wants to buy your used handguns and hunting guns. Renegade River, your hunting, camping, and survival store. Stop in and check out their new and used firearms, sporting goods, Army and Navy supplies, and survival gear. Downtown Spring Lake, next to the police station.